welcome to Space, the show where we discuss the week's top stories with Min's editor, Sukumar Ranganathan. Sukumar, welcome to the show. The biggest story this week has been the 2G presidential reference, right? The two things which are coming out of it. One is that it is delegated powers back to the executive, which there was a fear that judiciary might take. And the other thing is that they've said that natural resources do not necessarily need to be auctioned all the time. Which out of these two do you think is more significant?
Depends on which filter you're looking at it from. If I think, if you look at it from the filter of governance, how India is run, the constitution was very clear on demarcation of responsibilities between the executive and the judiciary. I think the problem was because of the way the government had been behaving and because of the 2G judgment that came out in January, there was a clarification that was needed because it did seem to suggest the judgment that the court was going to set government policy in terms of allotting natural resources. So I think the court has clearly said that it is not going to do so. And by doing so, it's just reiterated the principles on demarcation of responsibilities laid down in the constitution, which I think is great, right? I think it's a very mature judgment. Yeah. If you look at it from the economic point of view, I think it's again very significant because an auction may be the best mechanism at finding a price, right? It's the best way to identify price discovery. In terms of price discovery, I don't think there's any other method which comes close. It's also the best way in which you can maximize your revenue. Sure. But the government's objective is not always revenue maximization. In fact, even in telecom, and I know this is a touchy subject, but if you go back and you look at the early 2000s, I think in 2000, the penetration, the teledensity of India, which means, the proportion of people in India who have access to a telephone connection was single digits. It was less than 5%. That number has risen.
Giving out was just fine.
Yeah, but at that point in time, when you were giving out spectrum, what was the logic for giving out spectrum at almost throwaway prices? If you look at it from today's filter, the logic was you wanted to have more people have phones. And I think that objective has been achieved. Today, the teledensity is in excess of 80%, right? So I think it makes, you can't frame any government policy with just an eye on how much money you can get. Second thing, you can't get greedy with the benefit of hindsight. Absolutely. Right? So you can't look at the amounts you're making from 3G and saying you can make the same amounts, retrospectively also. That's not how it works.
So do you think that this judgment will leave a lot of scope for interpretation? Because like you have said, that you can't look at hindsight and decide what was good and what was not. So a government may decide that, maybe auction is the best way, but the court may say that, no, maybe it was not.
Sure, of course it will. It will leave room for interpretation. There will be room for discretion. But then that's why we elect governments, right? In any democracy, we don't elect a government in the anticipation that we get a completely corrupt government which is going to be incentivized by all kinds of things to do things that are not good for the country in the long term. You can't make that assumption, right? You can't start off with that assumption. So the government of the day, one would assume, will act with responsibility, with farsightedness, with wisdom and with fairness to allot resources. Now, if it doesn't, and again the judgment that was delivered yesterday was very clear on that, if it doesn't, and if there is some capriciousness shown in how these resources are allotted, and if someone complains to the court, then the court says it will look into it. So I think, again, in the constitution, those checks and balances are there, and I think those were reiterated. But I know exactly where you're coming from, because some people, yesterday also, I came across several opinions that said this will just give the government the ability to do what it wants to be discretionary in terms of framing a policy to allot resources. Of course, the government needs to have a free hand to do so, because that's why we've elected them. Otherwise, you should just have the courts running everything.
Right. So either ways, the government has heaved a sigh of relief after yesterday's judgment. Another interesting thing this week has been that Chief Economic Advisor Raghuram Rajan has given the first set of press interviews, and he's talking about a few promising things. One is that growth will not dip below 5.5%. He's talking about subsidy cuts. He's talking about reforms. How do you read these signals and what is about to come?
5.5% is bad enough, right? There was some time in the beginning of this year and even towards the middle of this year when we did seem to run the risk of going below that. So in some ways, his statement it's a very reassuring statement because it comes from an economist of tremendous stature. The other things he said, especially with relation to subsidies and other things, again, it in some ways reaffirms that at the core of the economic policy making of this government, there is some reformist thinking that is there, right? But the real issue is how do you take growth back? Maybe not to the level at which it was in 2006 and 2007, because the excess of 9% is seems almost impossible from where we are sitting now, but in excess of 7.5%, in excess of 8%. And I think that's where one still doesn't get a coherent vision from the government, because you really need to invest in capacity building to do that. Right. What they've done so far will help arrest the slide. What they've indicated they will do will again help arrest the slide. But merely allowing merely allowing foreign companies to invest in various sectors in India in which they were not previously allowed to invest is not going to change things. Right. So that's what one would like to see. But again, good message comes out from a man with tremendous credibility, tremendous intelligence, tremendous stature as an economist, and very, very reassuring, especially given what the government has done over the last 2 weeks.
So you're basically saying that in the short run, in the short time, we could not see a lot of impact of these measures. Maybe in the long run, they'll kind of help in getting back the investment, etc.
Two things really, which I'm trying to say. One, they have to keep doing whatever they've been doing. Yeah. Two, they'll have to do more. But this interview and his interviews, across publications and television channels seem to suggest that they are keen to do things and change things, which is a very different message, and this, than what we used to get even 2 years ago.